Indinue magani dog. Bangia to go ninita Anishinabe. Idesh gojutunji Anishinabe moyan. Nigikin dodem. Keegitah indigo Anishinabe mong. Lindsay Nindigenous Jaganashi mong. Nayashi winigamingnin donjaba. Good evening, everyone. I'm grateful to be speaking to those of you in attendance at the 2019 Multilingual Community Interpreter Services AGM. It is the United Nations International Year of Indigenous Languages. My remarks today will focus on the challenges facing Indigenous languages and the ways that language activists are overcoming these challenges. I hope that these remarks will help you see the ways in which the work you're doing in language services is part of this broader movement amongst Indigenous communities to address language barriers. I began by introducing myself in Anishinaabe, the language spoken by my ancestors on my father's side of the family. It is a language that is still spoken today by an estimated 100,000 people. Some of these speakers reside in Toronto, since Toronto is part of the ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. Anishinaabe territory extends from Quebec in the east to Saskatchewan in the west, and south to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I wish I could invite you all to come home with me to my reserve, the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, which is about a 3-hour drive north of Toronto, always depending on the traffic, up the Bruce Peninsula, and it's nestled along the beautiful blue waters of the Georgian Bay. We could have a cup of tea and I could drive you around the reserve and introduce you more intimately into our community life. Instead, I'll leave you with a future invitation. Every August, we have a powwow that is open to the public to come and enjoy dancing, singing, cultural activities, food, visiting, and taking in the beautiful lands where our powwow is held. If you can't attend ours, there are other powwows and other similar events around Southern Ontario that are open to the public to attend. I believe that a powerful way to promote language justice is simply by coming together across our differences to enjoy one another's company. In our world of fast-paced living, where busyness is often seen as a badge of honor, forming deep friendships can be quite a radical act. In my introduction, I began by saying Anin Indinue magani dog. This means hello, all of my relations. It is common in our linguistic culture that when introducing yourself, we begin by acknowledging that we are all relations, part of the same human family. Our stories teach us that our relations extend even beyond the human family to the animals, plants, water, rocks, sky, weather, and all that makes up the earth. I then said that I am only learning Anishinaabe. I am not a fluent speaker. And I introduced myself as a member of the Otter clan. I said that my English name is Lindsay and my Anishinaabe name is Keegitah, and where my community is geographically. Anishinaabe is a highly verb-based language. For example, our word for blueberry pie is Chigayatewe mitagoje minabashke minasagana bitusijigana jigwa bikinigane bukwejigan. This means old-time Frenchman exploding blueberries, blueberry sauce layered between thing, bend over, and put it in the oven bread. You can imagine with such a descriptive language that meetings like this AGM tonight can take quite a while and might last beyond people's bedtimes. It is also speaks to the rich worldview that native speakers of this language have. It's a story-based understanding of the world, and this storytelling tradition lives on today, even if many of our stories are now told in English instead of Anishinaabe because of language loss. In Canada, there are about 70 Indigenous languages and 10 language families. Each language is unique. I'm not qualified to speak to all of these Indigenous languages and the particular challenges that each of them are facing and what revitalization efforts are underway. So I'll focus most of my remarks on the Anishinaabe language, but recognizing that there are many similarities between what is happening to our language as well as other Indigenous languages. Prior to the formation of Canada, Indigenous peoples living here often spoke multiple languages. For example, my great-great-grandfather, Charles Giganos Jones, who was born in 1852, he spoke Anishinaabe and Mohawk, as well as English and French. We had advanced trading networks that put us in contact with other tribes across Turtle Island or North America. When European settlement increased and Canada was formed in 1867, the Indian Act was passed about 10 years later. The purpose of this act was to suppress Indigenous peoples by taking away our rights to participate in our communities as we had historically, as well as our ability to participate in settler society. For example, it wasn't until the 1950s or 60s that Indigenous peoples received the right to vote. There were many years where they could not be doctors or lawyers if they wanted to maintain their Indian status and be part of their community. The Indian Act is still the primary piece of legislation in effect today governing Indigenous peoples' lives. It has been changed since 1876, but many of the underlying racist components are still in effect. Residential schools were another factor that worked to systematically destroy Indigenous peoples' ability to speak our languages and live in healthy families. While children were away from home at these government schools, which were also often run by churches, they were forced into a way of being and learning that was so different from their own families that when they finally did come home, often after various years, they struggled to integrate back into the lives of their parents and grandparents and other relatives. Many people from my community went to Spanish residential school, which was just one of the approximately 130 residential schools that were in operation across the country. The last residential school closed in 1996. And Indigenous child welfare activists like to point out that while 1996 marked the closing of the last residential school, there are actually more Indigenous children in foster care today than there were at the children in residential schools at the height of that institution. So that's a lot of Indigenous children that are still living outside of their families, disconnected from those cultural teachings, including language, and maintaining those incredibly important relationships. So we have a lot of work to do. Language rights in Canada have been discussed extensively in courts and parliamentary meetings. In the early colonial period, parts of Canada were known as New France or British North America, and French and English are now the official two languages of this country. Despite the extensive discussion surrounding the importance of language to identity, culture, and health, Indigenous languages have not been afforded even close to the level of protection given to French and English. In fact, as was just stated, they were actively suppressed through government policy, residential schools, and settlement. Fortunately, though, Indigenous peoples and our languages are resilient. So I'd love to outline some of the more recent efforts towards revitalization. Last year, in 2018, I published a book with the University of British Columbia Press entitled Otter's Journey Through Indigenous Language and Law. It is a work of creative nonfiction embedded in Anishinaabe storytelling traditions. In it, I follow the protagonist Otter from my reserve, Anishinaabe, to Nunavut, New Zealand, New Hampshire, Vancouver Island, Minnesota, and then back to Anishinaabe. Otter learns what was happening in these parts of the world with Indigenous languages. In Nunavut, for example, the Inuit are over 80% of the population. I lived there as a 14-year-old and was surprised that in high school there were no immersion in Inuktitut classes. A lot of the teachers were from the south, so they would come up to the north for short contracts, sometimes a year or 2 years, would do their teaching and then would return back south. So they weren't trained in speaking the language. And then the teacher, there was an Inuktitut language class that you could opt in to take, and the teacher there was an elder who was not trained in managing a class of about 30 teenagers. Often there are behavioral issues that arise, and it wasn't how language was passed on traditionally by being in your family settings and homes, by doing activities out on the land such as hunting, fishing, trapping, berry picking, whatever it might have been. So that was a real difficulty for passing on language in the school system in Nunavut, despite the high population of Inuit people overall. Something that I was impressed with is that the Akitsarat College in Nunavut is a post-secondary institution where students can learn alongside Inuit knowledge keepers and Western-trained educators. So there are some exciting things happening in the schooling system there, and then the Nunavut legislature and the courthouse that's there. There's opportunities to speak your language, and there's translators who are trained in ensuring that those who end up in that Western legal system are able to understand what rights are before them and what's happening in those proceedings. And there are some unique structures in place that incorporate Inuit ways of being, so that it's not just a wholesale transportation of Western laws and language into that setting. Next, after Nunavut, Otter travels to New Zealand. And here she gets to learn about what's happening with Māori languages. And she learns that it is one of the official languages of New Zealand. Now, New Zealand, or Aotearoa, is quite unique from Canada because Māori is the only Indigenous language there. You'll remember earlier I mentioned that there are 70 approximately Indigenous languages in Canada. So it's much easier for a state to protect one language over 70 different languages. So in their education system, from little babies who are in daycare all the way up to high school, they have programs called Kohangareo and Kura Kaupapa, which are immersion programs for young New Zealanders to learn Māori language and culture. And then in universities as well, you can take Māori language classes throughout the whole time and incorporate that into your degree. They also have Māori TV, which is a television network where there are programs in the Māori language. They have Māori radio, so you can flip on a radio station and get to hear songs in the Māori language. The commentators will be speaking Māori. And if you go to the Bank of New Zealand and head to the ATM, you can choose whether or not to do your transaction in English or Māori. So there's lots of exciting pedagogies and resources in place in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that are reviving that language that has been under some suppression since colonial contact. Next, Otter traveled to New Hampshire, and here she was wanting to explore reasons why some post-secondary institutions are creating excuses around why they can't teach Indigenous languages. So some of these reasons include that they say that the only Indigenous language that can be taught in that school is the one that is from that area. So, for example, this would mean that the University of Toronto could not teach the Cree language, for example, because it is on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territories. But by the same argument, you could say that it shouldn't have Italian or Mandarin or Russian language programs because those also are not the Indigenous territories of Toronto. So you see that there's a double standard here in what languages are okay to teach at a school. Another argument that some people make against having Indigenous languages taught in post-secondary institutions is the lack of materials available for teaching, and that it would be very difficult for students to go somewhere and have an immersion experience and actually gain fluency in that language. So the counter argument to this is that, well, you could easily create materials. That's not that hard to do. We're very creative people with all sorts of generative ideas. And that, in fact, there are reserves where speakers who are there would love to have young people come in and speak with them and help inspire their youth to learn their language, and again, create materials and excitement around these programs. And then also lack of funding is always a concern that people bring up. That is, why should students tuition go to an Indigenous language course when it's not seen as practical? So these are all questions that could be asked of other university courses too, yet they go ahead and offer them anyways. So it seems that Indigenous languages have an extra hurdle that educators and students must overcome before they can do this revitalization work. The chapter set on Vancouver Island looks at why some federal organizations are not leading the way in reconciliation and the struggles that come with the deep bureaucracy of corporate institutions, whether they be excellent institutions in many ways, such as Parks Canada, doing a lot of excellent work in the conservation of the natural areas of this landscape, but then also on their path of reconciliation, but often not doing all that they could be in order to incorporate, recognize Indigenous sovereignty and incorporate language and culture and laws throughout. The chapter set in Minnesota explores, again, public post-secondary institution language programs, and then why learning on reserve or in community is not always necessarily better than in urban off-reserve settings. So what I mean here is that some people believe that you have to go to an Indigenous community to learn that language. And you need to be immersed with elders that are there and be in the cultural context and on the landscape. But actually there are online courses that are being taught because more Indigenous people now are living off reserve than they are on reserve. So we need to make sure that we're allowing Indigenous people to grow outside of these tiny parcels of land that the government have reserved for them, and recognize that we're living on all over the world, not even just in Canada too. So for, say, an Anishinaabe person who's living in Australia or in Hong Kong, they too can join an online language learning class and be able to speak with people who are also passionate about learning the language, who are not always ethnically Anishinaabe. There are all sorts of people of diverse backgrounds who are seeing it as important to learn these languages and recognizing that when we're living on the traditional territories of a First Nation, then it shows a lot of respect if we learn about who that First Nation is and what their teachings are and what they find permissible in that area. And language learning can be an excellent way of connecting yourself and rooting yourself to a place that might be new to you. Eventually, Otter returns back to Nawash, and she synthesizes the teachings from the previous chapters in these different parts of the world. And she teaches a local family on the reserve what it is that they can be doing to revitalize their languages and help them understand more deeply why we don't always speak them as well as we think we should, and to not feel shame about it. Sometimes I think people feel locked in trauma because it was a traumatic experience to have colonization happen, and it's ongoing. And so some young people feel like they should speak their language because their grandparents speak it, and it can feel really shameful not to speak your language. And I think the quote that jam is for preserving and tradition is for living is an important quote in this context because our languages are living, our traditions are living. We can't be preserving or freezing one particular way of being Indigenous, but in today's world, the youth need to be able to participate in both their ancestral ways of being and with their current families, as well as with the teachings of broader society. So this year, the federal government passed the Indigenous Languages Act, which you may have heard about in the news. And personally, I think it's a good step towards further revitalization of Indigenous languages. However, there has been mixed reviews about the act. Some say that Trudeau announced this because he had just announced that the Kinder Morgan pipeline had been approved and he needed to find some low-hanging fruit of good news to pass on to Indigenous people. But others see it as positive because it does provide long-term sustainable funding of Indigenous languages. It establishes an Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages, and it facilitates collaboration between federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments to deliver support for revitalizing languages. So I think this is a good step of support, but of course all the work is to follow after the passing of this act. And it should be noted as well that it was negotiated between the federal government and then the national Inuit, Métis, and First Nation organizations. And the Inuit were particularly unimpressed with the Indigenous Languages Act because it didn't incorporate the specific needs of their community members. So today, there are grassroots organizations all across the country creating video games, films, books, cell phone apps, all to engage the youth in language learning. There are some immersion schooling programs for various Indigenous languages, certainly not all of them, that people can attend. And there are excellent websites such as firstvoices.com that record Indigenous languages and work with different speakers and communities to have interactive activities that anyone, anywhere, anytime can log on to and improve their proficiency in that language. There are also community language tables being held where people get together and speak with one another. There are board games. There are concerts sometimes that will be hosted in an Indigenous language. And all of this is working to bring people together and develop healthy relationships and connection with their language. And in remote communities, particularly up north, where people do still speak their Indigenous language regularly, it's important for them to have translators who are trained in access to justice and the necessary programs that are there. And research has unequivocally demonstrated that Indigenous people's acquisition of traditional languages correlates to increased self-esteem and community well-being, among many other positive gains. So this is all important work. It's an important part of the overall puzzle of wellness and ensuring that the gaps, the socioeconomic and wellness gaps that exist between Indigenous peoples in Canada and the rest of the population are closed, because we're all equal and everyone deserves the chance at the best life they can have. So I wish you each the opportunity to learn more about Indigenous languages and to continue the important work you are doing in providing access to services for those living in Ontario who do not speak dominant languages. Miigwech Bizendawieg. Thank you everyone for listening.